The document itself acknowledges that there are vacancies across the NHS totaling 112,000, so huge vacancies. The NHS is, I think, the largest single employer in Europe still, but that's a huge number of vacancies. And the plan's own modelling suggests that those vacancies would rise to 360,000, so almost triple by 2037, which is the 15-year period over which the NHS long-term workforce plan covers in terms of its planning. So without action, those would increase to 360,000. So just spending a few moments just looking at the contents page, because this is giving you a bit of an introduction this morning, but if you want to know more, then pick up the document and have a look. But just to know what to expect, there's a summary. We'll be spending most of our time in that summary section, actually, because it pulls the most important information from the other areas, and then we'll be dipping in and out of the other chapters, covering case for change. There's three main priority areas identified in this document, which comprise or make up chapters 2, 3, and 4, and that's train. So they talk a lot about training, they talk a lot about retain, they talk a lot about retaining staff, and they talk about reform, which is about sort of working differently, doing things differently. There's quite a lot in that area, actually, which is really interesting. Then they talk about next steps, and then there's some interesting information in the annexes, but largely about how they have calculated various things around demand and staffing and assumptions that they've made when pulling this report together. So, forward. I'm just going to check in with Andy. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, welcome back, Andy.
Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. I have no idea what happened. It just decided to go whappy as I dialed in and stuff. So apologies for that and for the experience you may have had as a result. But definitely glad to be back. And yeah, let's have a look at this document. As Andy said, lots of stuff in there. The three key things about the train, retain, and reform. We're going to go through those in a bit more detail in the case for change in particular. But as ever, there's always that summary / forward / thing. So let's take a look at it, shall we, Andy?
Yeah, so a lot of this is sort of, the NHS is 75 years old. It's a big achievement. It's valued, and so forth. But just some interesting things to pull out is just that vacancy level, which we mentioned earlier in the introduction. But 112,000. I was just, Gandhi, how many people work in the NHS? It's just struck me that we could do with some context for that. And the document itself doesn't actually provide the overall staffing numbers. But have you got any sense of? No, it's. I know it's the largest employer in the world. Or
I mean, I think like you said, it's the largest employer in Europe. I think it's the fourth or third largest employer in the world. And you're right. A lot of the stuff in the document, rather than talking about current numbers, it talks about training. So increasing the actual numbers and stuff.
Yeah, so big vacancies. Documents projections project that will sort of triple to maybe 360,000 by the end of the 15-year period covered by this document. So, and that's if we do nothing. So it's making the case for doing something, making the case for taking the measures described in this document, essentially. And then the forward introduces those three priority areas. So we're looking at train. So they're really talking about significant increases in the numbers of training places of professionals across the board, actually, and they're also talking about changes into how those are structured. So we'll be talking a little bit more, but one of the most interesting things for me was the introduction of apprenticeship training for it looks like practically all roles, including that of medical doctors, which I think is really, really interesting. We'll look at what that means and what we might expect from those sort of when we get to that section. But that was something I thought was really exciting, actually. Working from a deprived area, I think that could open up a lot of opportunities for people who live in my area that might not afford to go to university or see that as something that they could do. Next priority area is retain. So they talk about keeping hold of the staff that are there and the sorts of measures that can be taken to increase staff retention, flexible working, etc., etc. And then they talk about reform. So different ways of working, changes to education. So I think we can reflect on those apprenticeship roles there as well, and highlighting the importance of embracing technology and so forth. So interesting. Yeah. Are you coming in there, Gary?
So I guess just to comment, so Christine has rather helpfully gone off on Google and said that apparently there's 1.27 million full-time equivalent staff working in the NHS trusts in England. So that's if you believe Google, which we tend to believe a lot of what it says and stuff. So yeah, a lot of
10% vacancy rate then, essentially.
Yes.
In the NHS.
And that's one of the challenges, isn't it? It's the vacancy rate and you know that focus on how do we increase the staffing, because as you're going to hear throughout this document, that the current situation cannot continue for the NHS to continue, but also you know it's about that retention, because actually that's probably the biggest challenge we see and things. But yeah, when we look at this overview, what we're seeing, Andy.
Yeah, so and actually, so I've been looking at some of the articles in Pulse and from NHS Confederation and Health Foundation and so forth. And actually, what you tend to find in those articles is they're kind of taking a lot of their information from this summary. You come to recognise the structure and see it elsewhere in these other articles. So they're to give an overview of those main areas, really. So and this is really the meat and bones of it. So pay attention to the next few minutes and you'll know what's being proposed in the workforce plan, or at least the headlines. So in terms of training, so we're talking about doubling the number of medical school training places. Some of these things are really, really big, bold,
grand,
Gandhi. You know, it's really quite grand. So doubling the number of medical school training places, up to £15,000 by a year, that's 10 years in the future. So doubling over the course of the next decades, and focusing those medical places on areas of greatest shortage and areas that need levelling up geographically. So it talks later that they will achieve this increase in numbers by increasing capacity at existing medical schools and establishing new medical schools. So I wonder if we might start seeing new medical schools in some of those areas that need levelling up and attached to some universities in some of those more deprived parts of the country, which I think would be a positive thing, actually. I know we've sort of locally, we both went to Nottingham Medical School, didn't we, Gandhi? And
I went to Leeds.
No, you didn't. I know that. Why did I say that? I went to Nottingham Medical School. And when I was there, they opened up a new graduate entry medical school in Derby, which is a neighbouring city, and a lot of and that's grown, and a lot more of the medical school activity takes place over there. So that was something new and expanded places. And then more recently, they're in the process of opening up a medical school at the University of Lincoln, which is in the county next door in Lincolnshire, and that started as a satellite of Nottinghamshire Medical School, and I believe it's going to bud off and form its own school. Lincolnshire is one of these areas actually that's quite deprived, so maybe we'll see more of that sort of activity. So also was an increased number of GP training places. So we're both GPs. I guess we're really interested in what's going to be, supporting general practice, the sector in which we work. Go on, Gandhi.
I'm going to jump in on there. So an interesting comparison there. So they're going to double the amount of med school places, but in terms of the actual number of GP places, that's only going up by 50%. And recognizing the fact that the push of work towards general practice does suggest that actually the capacity that they recognize there's a training capacity challenge here, but also the output of what people will see in terms of the number of GPs to deal with that workload may not be where it needs to be. I don't know, perception thing, I think, but obviously there are so many of the challenges in that. But it's just an interesting comparison, doubling medical school, but actually the number of people being trained is only going up by 50% when it comes to general practice.
Yeah, so half the increase in GP training places percentage-wise. That's interesting, isn't it? Because they are constantly acknowledging in documents that they want to move work from secondary care to primary care, and acknowledging a need for primary care staff and infrastructure, but they're not backing that up with an increase in training places that is comparative to the increase in overall medical training. So this implies more consultants, more hospital doctors, doesn't it? Which
it does.
Seems to run contrary to what is felt to be needed, or at least articulated as what is being needed. So that's interesting observation there, Gandhi. So increases are not just limited to medical school and GP training places. I think that's probably what we'll end up talking about more than the other areas, because that's an area where we've got experience. But they talk about increases to all. There's a good chart which we'll spend some time on later that shows the proposed increases to all sorts of different medical professions and allied health professionals. But that's about increasing training places in nursing by 92%. Midwifery,
it's a whopping increase.
It's huge, isn't it? Almost doubling the number of training places for nurses. This is incredibly ambitious. Midwifery training places up to around 58,000. Not sure what that means in percentage terms. And they're talking about, again, this apprenticeship routes coming up with 20% of registered nurses qualifying through apprenticeship routes, 9% now. So it is happening at the moment, but a big increase in that. And 22% overall of clinical staff being trained by apprenticeship routes. So I say that's a big theme in this, and we'll probably talk about that a bit more.
Yes,
later.
we will definitely come to that when we come to the reform and the training part of this document and stuff, which is going to be really interesting because there's lots of theory, and this is the stuff that obviously hit the headlines in huge detail. So you will want to join us for that part. Interesting, just to mention it as well, because I don't want to forget this. Yakshita Dave coming in with training and supervision is something they don't seem to have addressed. Well, we'll find out if that's in there later on.
Excellent. And then, yeah, they're talking again about medical degree apprenticeships. That's a big feature of this proposal, with 2,000 of those places on those schemes in 10 years' time. Expanding dentistry places. There is a shortage of dentists, most definitely. I see that for my patients. So increasing dentistry places by 40%. Some interesting proposals around retaining dentistry later. I mean, we'll probably talk about it in more detail, but later they talk about, I forget exactly how they word it, we will come to it, but essentially if you're trained in dentistry and that's cost the taxpayer, money in terms of subsidizing your training, then you will be obliged to work in NHS dentistry for a unspecified period of time or an unspecified amount of work in order to satisfy your training and not have to pay back your training costs, I suppose. So they don't really talk about the penalty, but that's how these sorts of schemes or clauses often work. And then and also a big focus of this is training more NHS staff domestically. So I guess we'll come to some of the figures later about the recruitment that happens from overseas, but it is enormous, and in particular areas such as nursing, it's a lot higher than I even thought it was. We'll get to the figure later, but I think something like 57% of all new nurses employed in the NHS come from overseas, which just feels absolutely astonishing. But they want to go on average across all professionals down to about 10% of the workforce recruited from overseas.
Yes, I believe the average across all the specialities is 25% is from abroad, and they want to move that down to 10% in the next 15 years. I guess quick point to mention, because this is going to come up a few times, there does seem to be different timeframes throughout this document. Obviously, the plan is meant to cover the next 15 years in total. Really important to recognise that there's certain timeframes that seem to be baked into a lot of the stuff, and we'll come to that when we come to training section, but particularly 2028, 29, and 2031, 32, and then obviously the 15-year one, which is the 36, 37 timeframes. That's where there's lots of stuff, and really interesting, obviously, how this is going to play with potential elections and stuff as well. But
yeah, I mean, and we will come to it, but the timescale for the funding. So the 2.4 billion is the headline funding amount, and I was trying to understand quite how that's profiled, because you read that and you think, gosh, the government's dropping 2.4 billion pounds on this right now in order to try and solve a dire situation, but that's not the case, and it looks like that's a cumulative amount over 6 years, it says.
And important to remember, that's less than 1% of the actual NHS budget. So I believe, and someone's welcome to Google this and correct me if I'm wrong, the current NHS budget is something like 150 billion. So it is a small percentage influx. It is an influx, let's not deny that, and we are in a cost of living increase challenge.
Andy.
Sorry?
I said it must be trillion. 1.5 trillion pounds. Billion?
No.
It can't be.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, Chris, someone needs to Google this for us.
No, I think it's 150 billion.
150 billion. No, sorry, you're right. That must be right. Yeah. Right. I don't know what's happening to my head.
Trillion is the American budget, Andy. Getting a bit confused.
Yeah, no, even accounting for that, I'm completely off with my maths there. But yeah, but that 2.4 billion is cumulative over 6 years, and it says that there will be an additional 600 billion. 600 million in the first 2 years. So the way I interpret that, and it is a little bit murky, is that by the time we get to year 6, there'll be 2.4 billion additional spend on the focus of this document. I think, I don't know, is that how you interpret it, Gandhi?
Very much so. It's not an instant influx, it's a graduated, staggered influx. And again, thank you to Christina coming in with the facts. So planned spending for the Department of Health and Social Care in England is 180.2 billion in 2022-23. Important to recognise that that's for everything that they do. So that's not just the amount that's spent on NHS England and healthcare. That's also public health and other things. And then the subsequent budget for the NHS is under that, which is why I think it was a bit less, about 150 odd. And then Ritu coming in, just a thought, maybe doubling medical students to safety net secondary care shifts covered as quoted. Potentially, yeah, increasing secondary care and having a benefit. That may be why there's a proportionate increased difference. But again, worried about that level of increase in general practice, but we'll come to that.
Absolutely. So the next key priority area is retain, embed the right culture, and improve staff retention. And they want to have up to 130,000 fewer staff leaving the NHS over the next 15 years. So you kind of have to break that down year on year, but it's a big number and it's a bold plan. The main things they reference in this, I had to look this up again, is that continue to build on what we know works and implement the actions from the NHS People Plan. I remember we talked about this actually.
We did
in the past, and this is a visualization. There's a document, that goes along with this, but it kind of broadly comprises of advice for NHS organisations about how to retain staff. It was unclear really whether there's any actually kind of direct funding allocated to some of these things. A lot of it feels like the sort of common sense things that organisations would do if they had the headspace and time to do, looking after people, sense of belonging, growing for the future, new ways of working, delivering care. It felt a little bit woolly, I think, when we looked at it at the time, although these are really good things, and if you've got the time and the skill to implement them, I'm sure that they are effective. So also implementing plans to improve flexible opportunities for prospective retirees. So that's retaining people within the workforce. They reference some of the changes that were made in the spring budget to pension tax arrangements that impacts some of those consultants, GPs, other experienced clinicians towards the end of their career, and sometimes disincentivises continuing in work, and that's work that is already in place. They talk about this NHS Emeritus Doctors Scheme to support recently retired consultants to support delivery of outpatient care. So I guess that's not doing the medical take, but carrying on your outpatient clinics. And there is a big backlog in secondary care, so this does feel quite sensible actually. I had made a note just saying, what about retiring GPs? Perhaps because that's where staff shortages are also acute. They're not scoped for some sort of lower intensity work pattern for retiring GPs. Not covered in this, but nice to see something for the hospital staff proposed, and maybe that's something that can be extended in the future for primary care.
Essentially,
commit to the ongoing national funding for continuing professional development. I just made a note here saying ongoing national funding, so then none of the new money's going for this, and I think a lot of probably what they're talking about is already kind of established part of working as a doctor. Having your development sessions, as a consultant, and I guess protected learning time as GPs. We're not sort of funded in the same way or backfilled for our learning, are we, in general practice? No. And it's really variable across the country, but hopefully that acknowledges a valuing of where that does happen, for that to continue.
But I don't think it actually mentions that would be available to GPs either. So
it's just a statement, isn't it? Commit to ongoing national funding. So I just hope that people can look at that and say, don't reduce the protected learning time opportunities in our area in primary care.
Despite the fact that's exactly what's just happened because of the strikes.
Yeah, well, that's something. We probably come to that at the end. But I guess nowhere in here does it mention. Actually, it does mention pay. I have highlighted that. It doesn't talk about how they will address it at all. But it does highlight that the NHS works in a competitive recruiting environment. For all staff, not just clinical staff. being incentivized to go off and work in Australia and other places, but for all staff, although it doesn't propose how they would address that. Occupational health and wellbeing services for all staff. I guess we should all have access to occupational health, although I think even in primary care, it's sometimes a little bit patchy or unclear who provides that to your staff at times. And wellbeing services. So I guess there's the wellbeing QOF QI that they can point to.
And I think that part in particular, I mean, we're going to come to it when we go into this section of retain in more detail. But I guess one thing I would recommend to those people who are joining us live and to those who are listening at this point, this is probably one of the areas that as an action for general practice, you may need to take forward. So how does your current occupational health system work? Do you have access to that? But also what additional services do you have access to? And the reason for doing that is it links massively with the QOF QI wellbeing pathways that many of you are probably looking at right now in terms of workload that needs to happen and stuff. So just wanted to identify it. We will come to that in more detail a bit later on, but definitely want to as an action, I would recommend anybody within general practice listening to this, check on this, because this is something that you should have. But I don't know how to access it in my local area. So when I read this yesterday, going through it in more detail, this is the thing I've put as an action plan for myself. I need to find out how that works.
Absolutely. I'm always precedent spotting in these documents. So this was an interesting statement. Explore measures with the government, such as a tie-in period to encourage dentists to spend a minimum proportion of their time delivering NHS care in the years following graduation. So I thought that was interesting. I know.
Do you want to magnify that one, Andy?
Yeah. New tool. Hang on. A little bit laggy. Here we go. Here's the magnifying glass. So, but that's where it is. So, so I guess the idea is, the country spends money on dentistry education, and a lot of dentists move out of providing NHS care, often fairly rapidly following graduation, and into the private sector. And it's suggesting addressing that by having a tie-in period. So that's interesting. But I think, if this happens for dentists, it may be something that happens for other staff, particularly if you're nipping off to Australia immediately after, graduating as a doctor within the first few years. Maybe the government will come knocking at your door to pay back some of your training, or something like that, to be released from your NHS commitment. So I think that's got the potential to set an interesting precedent if that goes
like you said, it's definitely precedent setting, and it's not uncommon when discussions in the media and if you ever do go into the comment sections of various things, they always talk about particularly that more right-wing element of it, that staff should be enforced to do a mandatory training period for the NHS rather than going abroad and stuff. And this is the first indication that this may ever actually happen. Focused very much on the dentists, and speaking to a few dentists, they were just like, yeah, best way to make people not want to be a dentist, to be honest, is how they took it. But obviously, a lot of that is down to the current situation that many dentists feel they have when it comes to the funding opportunities they've got for NHS versus private care. And is that a marker of the way that the system is funded rather than necessarily the training and everything else and stuff? So really big precedent, I think they're setting there, to be honest.
Yeah, people draw parallels with other areas of life, such as the military. You can get a military bursary to support you with paying for your degree, and then you owe a bit of time to the military afterwards. So there's a bit of precedent there. I would say that's structured a bit differently though, because they are helping you with the self-funded part of your degree there. Which is actually quite different to, I think, what's been suggested with dentists, because I understand, dentists, they just pay their 9,000 a year, and that this would be something in addition for, to tie in because of some of the student funded costs. So it's quite different. So just highlighting, people do draw parallels, but those parallels aren't quite as parallel as they might seem on first pass. So moving on to reform. So reform, working and training differently. So this is an interesting area. There's quite a lot of changes suggested, really. So there's a focus on expanding enhanced, advanced and associate roles. And we will get to that table showing the proposed increases in various staff training places, but they definitely have their place, and we'll definitely be seeing more of those sorts of jobs and roles in the NHS, according to the plan. So, and just to put some numbers around that, so I think they say about 1% of the workforce is made up by these roles. They're suggesting 5% of the NHS workforce should be made up of these roles by the end of the plan. So we'll take that to be 15 years. And they're talking about 6,300 advanced practitioners. So there's a range of different professions, right, Gandhi?
Yeah. So advanced practitioners is that potentially top end of the clinical spectrum for the individual kind of specialty based additional roles. So I guess the parallels we could draw within our PCN work. So obviously we've got pharmacists, we've got physiotherapists, we've got nurse practitioners, those kind of things. But when they get to that slightly higher level, operating at the top of their kind of clinical level, that's when they get termed as advanced clinical practitioners. And that's kind of the umbrella term they're now using, recognizing that people can come from any of those potential or different specialities. I've not mentioned all of them, to work at that kind of level, which some would say is, on par with, the top of the medical roles in terms of, GPs and consultants and that kind of stuff. Maybe a little bit under in terms of responsibility and stuff, but actually I think that's very much organizational based as well. So, and as ever, it's always down to the individuals, in my view, how good they are at those particular things rather than necessarily what the role can let them do.
Yeah. And so particularly they're highlighting more nursing associates, up to 10,000 training places. Did you raise your hand there?
This is an interesting one, I think, Andy. So nursing associates, just for clarity, is a training program to become effectively a nurse. So I think this is where that apprenticeship model element of stuff comes more into play. And interestingly, particularly in general practice, we never really had nursing associates until the PCN DES made them a reimbursable role a year and a half ago, I think it was, roughly. So, that's an interesting one to see. I think in hospitals, they're much more commonly available and people, can train. And that the whole point is that allows them to become a nurse. I think it's, as an operational level, it's equivalent to a healthcare assistant, but it's a healthcare assistant with some additional qualities and stuff that makes them more available to become, like I said, nurses. And then you've even got the trainee nursing associate role, which I find even more complicated, to be honest, to understand, because I think that's just basically a healthcare assistant, but it's just termed in another way and different things. But as ever, if anybody can clarify that in the comments, please do, because I think it's an area even we struggle to understand sometimes in terms of the variance differences between the different roles.
Absolutely. Increasing physician associate training places to over 1,500 over the next 10 years. And they're talking about growing the proportion of NHS staff working in mental health and primary and community care, grow these roles by 73% by 2036-37. I guess we can just return to that increase GP training places by 50% that we were talking about earlier. So that's still sort of not keeping pace with general aspirations to increase staff in community care settings. To highlight that. So talking about reform, so work with professionals to embrace technological innovations such as artificial intelligence and robotic assisted surgery, convene an expert group to identify advanced technology that can be used more effectively in NHS. So just talking about technology. They don't talk an enormous, they do talk about technology, but I guess this isn't a document about technology. This is about workforce, but they're just acknowledging that that is an area where the NHS can be more effective and more productive, and it's important to invest with that. I guess people need, when you get into the detail, people need to be trained how to use these technologies and to be accepting of these new technologies and approaches. So it's appropriate that it's there. And they name dropped the TOEFL review. I just looked it up again. I remember I think we looked at this at the time again, as well. Nice interactive background on their website here. Although that's pre-pandemic now. That's 2019, and I definitely remember talking about that in groups before everyone was wearing masks. So even that might be a little bit out of date and maybe due a refresh.
And it's interesting that obviously this mentions about the use of tech in healthcare. Obviously, the thing that's happened in the interim for the length of time it's taken to publish the workforce review is the introduction of generative AI in the world. and the recognition that that's going to just, it is a situational change that's going to happen in the way that the whole of our lives work and stuff, and the impact that will have. It briefly mentions AI in this document, but actually that's a question that does need to be considered as to how AI is actually going to change every aspect of things, including workforce and how that works. And it does make some mention that the use of tech and AI will have an impact on the workforce that we need. Obviously, it's not detailed enough. I think we're still in that place where people don't really recognise what that's going to have an impact on. But it's an interesting one, and definitely one that I know at points we will probably end up going into it anyway, won't we, Andy?
Yeah, and it's just interesting because in order to make predictions about workforce demand and requirements, out towards 15 years, they make a number of assumptions, one of which is an assumed level of productivity growth of, I think, 1 to 2%. And that's something that, the use of generative AI could potentially change significantly, and their predictions, might be way off. They also acknowledge that it's kind of a living plan and it might change over time. But just interesting. It's challenging making predictions and planning things like on this sort of timescale. But then also because it takes so long to train health professionals, actually it might take 10, 15 years really to fully train and have an experienced GP, for example. You have to plan this far out. It's challenging, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let's talk about the importance of generalist core skills. That's just something that just comes through in a number of places that I'd highlighted there. And then they just acknowledge, okay, the new roles that we've been talking about need to be appropriately regulated by the GMC or some other body, and they're highlighting the GMC. And they talk about working with the professional colleges and the GMC to make sure the new roles are properly regulated, which is very, very sensible.
And with that, in the addition of the regulation for some of the roles as well, so it mentions anaesthesia, something or other, and physicians associates, which I know physicians associates in particular, many people are looking at, because that may then enable them to prescribe, which has been one of the challenges that they obviously face in terms of the productiveness and stuff that they can have because of that.
Yeah, and I think actually later in the document they do to talk about a pathway towards prescribing for physicians associates. That's acknowledged in there. Support experienced doctors to work in general practice under the supervision of qualified GPs. So I guess this is sort of career grade, SAS doctors that they're talking about here. That's interesting because they all need supervision of a fully qualified GP, of which there aren't enough of, and of which there's a more modest increase in training places compared to other training places and medical entries. So there might be a bit of a bottleneck forming there, or a change in that role to be one of more supervision and less direct clinical contact with GPs. But of course, that's what the public often say that they want. But more hands to the pumps. That's probably welcome. Did you have any strong feelings about that one, Gandhi?
So it's an interesting one, and we're going to highlight a comment by Ritu actually that she's put on. So all the suggested job roles need GP supervision and presence. So the GP takes ultimate responsibility for the others' errors. It feels like work, WIC infrastructure being considered for solving primary care.
I'm not quite sure. Right? Yeah.
Sorry.
Walk-in centre? Is that mean? WIC?
Potentially, yeah. I wasn't quite sure what. Yeah, it makes sense. Walk-in centre and stuff. I'm going to relate this back to our review we did the other week. So the state of education and training in practice and medicine in practice by the GMC, which highlighted that obviously when they looked at the various professions, the burnout risk was highest in GPs and even more higher in trainers. So when you go to the two cohorts of GP and GP trainers in particular, burnout risk is stupidly high because of lack of provision and time and resources. And the workforce plan very much is focusing on increasing training. And as part of that, the reforms are very much about increasing the number of people coming through. There's very little in here about support for those trainers, for those people doing the training, whether that's in general practice or whether that's in secondary care. It doesn't really, from what I could pick out, give as much detail in terms of support for that and how that's going to be compensated, because obviously many of these trainers are still doing the day job. Like I know you're planning on doing as well, and many of our colleagues and stuff who, it just raises the question, where's the supervision capacity coming through? And I think that point by Ritu about the responsibility, we've seen that actually just recently in the headlines, about some unfortunate stories that happened with patients where they felt they haven't had the service they should have done because they weren't seen by a GP, they're seen by somebody who was being supervised. And actually that's the public perception to some degree as well. And that's something that needs tackling.
Absolutely. The next sentence, I'm really not quite sure what function this is serving. It says work with regulators and others to take advantage of EU exit freedoms. So not quite sure what they're referring to.
This was one I struggled with as well.
I don't know, are they going to get rid of European Working Time Directive and have everybody working enormous hours again? Or anyway, it's vague, and one wonders if it's designed for a certain audience, but I'll say no more there. And then this one has been quite controversial. Support medical schools to move from a 5 or 6 year degree program to a 4-year degree program to meet the same established standards by the GMC, so the same standards. So maybe we're talking about more compressed courses, less generous holiday. It's interesting. And they also say support as well. So when I first read about this in some of the initial articles covering this document, it sounded a bit like it was to be mandated, or that all courses were going to be reduced, but they're going to support medical schools to move. So it sounds like this will be in collaboration with medical schools, and that maybe not all medical schools will be obliged to do this. And maybe actually there might be market forces at play. Some people might want a 4-year medical degree. Some people might not want a 4-year medical degree. It might depend where they apply. So what did you think about this, Gandhi?
I mean, like you said, this is one of the big reform changes that they're talking about, is basically shrinking training. And it's not just in terms of medical. They do mention this in some of the other ones in terms of improving the accessibility, and then obviously the apprentice model in terms of training and stuff. But, there's lots of concerns that when is this just being done to increase the supply? But then what is the quality that you get afterwards? Because actually we know that medicine is a massive degree. It's always been that way because of the amount of information people need to learn. And actually there is more. Many people come out of medicine degrees feeling that they're not fully prepared for what they need to do. The stuff around the communication side of things has taken a massive focus. Pharmacology, a lot of places have reduced the amount of teaching they do in pharmacology because they feel it's not needed. But actually, are we then seeing more issues in terms of prescribing challenges? And actually, the training and supervision, there probably needs to be more of that, because actually doctors, GPs, medics can be asked to supervise more people, and that's not part of the training. So it kind of makes the argument, in my view, that training needs to be expanded to allow for the time for that to work more effectively. Could things be changed? Possibly. Absolutely. Yeah. Maybe it does need reform in that sense, but shrinking it?
Yeah, we were talking. I mean, it's not long since the RCGP was recommending an increase in the training time for general practice from 3 to 4 years, acknowledging the increased complexity of the role, and actually to some degree, my experience of training is that because of things like the European Working Time Directive and so forth, although that may not directly apply to people not paid for their time, like students, but it has. I think created a culture where people probably for good reasons and for their own sanity, spending less time at work, when training. But I think that lends itself to the idea of increasing training length rather than reducing it. I don't know. I've got mixed feelings about this, and my initial thoughts as someone who's done a 5-year medical degree was, I'm glad it wasn't 4. I didn't, it felt like being it was a big shock to the system beginning work after 5 years. So, goodness knows what it would have been like after 4. I'm not sure I would have wanted to do a 4-year degree. Another thing was I was speaking to a colleague, and he immediately said, "Oh, does this mean that our training will be less compliant with other countries like Australia and Canada and New Zealand? That people will have to do some additional exams or qualifications in order to emigrate, and that people will be locked into the UK system?" And maybe that's a little bit too cynical, but I just thought that was an interesting initial knee-jerk observation.
Yeah, but like I say, it is a valid point, isn't it? The fact that because that's going to change, is that going to have an implication in people's abilities to go to other country and then stop some of that bleed that they are seeing because of a statutory change that they're going to make? Interestingly, Rita's come up with another point. Maybe the 4-year training would work for mature students who've already completed medically related subjects, e.g. pharmacology, biomedical. I think that's a realistic discussion, because they've got the elements of training and understanding from that point of view, similar to how, for example, doctors doing max fac, so dentists that have done a full dental degree, then when they come in to do max facs on the medical side, they only often join in for the final 3 years rather than the first 2 years, because they've already done that element of training and understanding and stuff. So I definitely agree there's the option when it comes to mature graduates, in terms of those who've already done a science-based degree and stuff, and potentially even some of the other ones. But en masse, reducing it, all I can say is I would not want to be a medical school course organizer right now.
I think this may be one, as Ritu says, for giving medical schools the flexibility to meet kind of special use cases in terms of degrees, which I think would probably then be welcomed. So just moving on. So they're just acknowledging. I think we might touch on this a little bit later in the points we've got planned, but they're sort of saying these opportunities to boost the labour are contingent on investment in other areas. They highlight infrastructure and technology. Actually the investment of 2.4 billion over that 6-year period of time itself is not sufficient to deliver this plan, and that there are other areas such as infrastructure, and later in the document they talk about that, meaning both real estate, places to put people, technologies, support infrastructure, logistics, and technology to support these people working, and that's not covered in this document. So
we talked about the kind of headline stuff and things, and I guess that's a lot of the information you may need to get started with this document. We're now going to talk about some of the more detailed stuff, aren't we, Andy, from those individual sections and stuff?
Yeah, and I think we can probably sort of dip in and do the highlights, I guess, and it might be that there's appetite for us to do one of the sections in more detail in the future. But I know we've made some notes against the document, so I guess we'll just be kind of dipping in and just seeing what we find is interesting. That summary is fantastic in terms of providing an overview of the structure and the key elements of the document. So these are things which maybe we feel that there's a bit of additional added value in terms of discussing. So we'll just scroll through. So they make the case for change, and it may be worth just articulating the headlines here, and we can dig in a little bit more if we want. But actually, they consider quite a lot of things in terms of building the case for change for this document. I guess part of this moving through government is actually convincing. We might feel it doesn't go far enough, but for many people, this level of spending may be too far. Within government, the Treasury, for example. So they do have to make a case within the document. So they're saying number of staff in the NHS has grown over the past decade, but there's rising demand, changes in patterns of access, changes in the types of treatments that are available, and demographic changes. People are getting older, people are getting more sick. So that's going to force demand, even if the level of the population remains static. They do highlight somewhere that actually the population in the UK is going up, so it's not a surprise that the number of medical staff needs to go up in proportion to that. They're acknowledging that historically we haven't been training enough staff. Just cherry picking here, really. They're also acknowledging these challenges are faced across the developed world. And actually, it was interesting because we looked at a few weeks ago there was, I think it was from the Commonwealth Foundation and the what they called the Health Foundation in the UK, highlighting actually primary care was similarly stressed in lots of countries, not just in the UK. So they probably are right in saying that these patterns in work, patterns in challenges in healthcare workforce are present across the world. Although I think the NHS is a particularly difficult case. There's a current focus on responding to immediate care needs, not planning for the future, not focusing enough on prevention. Just scrolling through, it must be later on where they acknowledge, and we've talked about it before, that there is 25% of recruitment is from overseas at the moment,
Yeah.
and that there is a current reliance on overseas recruitment, which they feel is not sustainable and not appropriate. But anyway, in that section, they are kind of just highlighting and making that case for change. It continues. There's 21 points. This graph I
This
thought was
is a good place to start, though, isn't it? The graph.
Yeah.
I think that's probably worthwhile spending a bit of time on that.
Yeah. Shall we get the magnifying glass out? I'm sure that will be useful. Yeah. So so on the screen we've got it's an infographic, isn't it, rather than a graph? And we're looking at the starting position. So we're saying that the current demand and these figures are hundreds of thousands of I think full-time equivalent roles, I think. And so the current demand, I'm going to get rid of the magnifying glass. Actually, it's oddly making it more difficult because I want the pointy bit. So current demand represented by a red block, current supply, and then current shortfall, which is 154,000 full-time equivalents there, and then this projections. So it's saying that the red bit will grow by this much, about 800,000 over the 15 years because of growth in demand. It's saying that the supply of staff will grow by this much, so there's about 200,000 person shortfall, but through improving retention, one of the pillars of this document, they're hoping to retain between 55 and 128,000 more staff. With the training measures, they're hoping to recruit an additional 122 to 181 full-time equivalent 1,000 staff. They're saying they're going to lose some more to reduce reliance on international recruitment. So there's a deliberate reduction in people coming from overseas of 58 to 6,300,000. They're hoping to increase other recruitment 15 to 110,000, and then they're going to retain some bank supply of 114,000. And this is how they intend, through the implementation of this plan, to reach the end position where supply just about meets demand. Hopefully that was useful. It's just interesting to look at how they are expecting the training element, the retention element, and the reform elements to have an impact on the numbers. So I just thought it was worth trying to understand that graph. Also in this section, they're just highlighting the shortfall in qualified GPs is projected to be 15,000 full-time equivalents in 15 years. I just noticed they're not in this document claiming that GP numbers have gone up and that sort of rhetoric that we have seen until late from the government. They seem to have sort of dropped that for this, and actually later in the document they acknowledged that I think GP numbers, full-time equivalent qualified GPs, fell by 1.8% in the last 1 year. So that's nearly 2% of full-time equivalent GPs left within the 1 year. The overall numbers of full-time equivalent GPs went up by, I think, 1.4% in aggregate, but that was because of the increase in training places. So actually qualified, unsupervised qualified GP numbers went down. I guess at some point they will start going up as those trainees come through if people stop leaving. But anyway, they're being more realistic, I think, about the numbers of GPs, which I think is really, really refreshing to see, I guess. So, and then the other bit I highlighted was they do. I've seen some criticisms of the document saying it doesn't do anything about estates. It doesn't do anything about the workforce in social care, which has a big impact on whether people can move from a hospital bed, back to their own home with a social care package. It doesn't address any of that. And actually, the document itself is quite open and honest about that. And they say actually, what is within scope for this document is the NHS Workforce. They acknowledge that other things will impact the effectiveness of these measures, including pressure on social care, including issues around infrastructure and estates, that some of this educational activity will need additional funding. I don't know whether they're directly alluding to the fact that you need to supervise these people in training, and that the cost of that is not necessarily reflected in these plans, or at least the presence or absence of the workforce to do this, as well as the day job, isn't acknowledged. So they do acknowledge those elements. So I thought that was worth worth highlighting. And then, yeah, so there we are at that section. And then the next steps section here in this section is really quite short. And actually, they sort of name drop things they're already doing. So on the changes already happening in the NHS to make it a more compassionate and inclusive culture. How's that been going in the last few years, Gandhi?
Doesn't feel that way, does it?
You know, I was being a little bit facetious in asking you that question. But actually, the NHS is quite an inclusive, you know, in terms of inclusive, culture, you know, I think that they're trying. I think people might feel not treated that well, particularly in terms of pay compensation, attitudes towards people taking strike action and speaking out against pay and conditions. You know, is not felt good. And maybe that's not coming from the NHS, but coming from the government, potentially. They acknowledge that we're merging Health Education England, NHS Digital and NHS England. You know, this will allow us to be more coordinated. So that's the next step, but I guess it's already happening. And
well, it's interesting. I think a lot of people would feel that change, that merger, has actually led to such a inefficiency currently in terms of how the organisations work that nobody seems to know who's doing what, to be honest. And that's caused an element of chaos that has had an impact in terms of how things are currently operating. So it's a change they've made with a longer term benefit rather than a short term benefit. And unfortunately, we're in that short term period. But it is interesting to see how that's had some impact, particularly that coupled with the change from CCGs to ICBs as well. So yeah,
change fatigue is rife in the NHS.
That's the NHS, isn't it?
So I think, should we focus on some of the graphs? I highlighted this graph, and people may want to hop in and have a look. Which is interesting is the comparison of practicing doctors per 1,000.
What page is that on, Andy? Sorry,
in 2021. Sorry,
what page was that on?
I'll just scroll to the bottom. Page 28.
Yeah. Of
the document. So practicing doctors per 1,000 population just highlights the UK's position. So, it's an interesting graph actually. So sort of towards the top, you've got countries like Austria, Norway, Spain, Germany, and Spain. You know, interestingly that it's there, not as rich as some of the other countries on this graph. And actually, you know, United States, you know, is lower. That really surprises me because I'd have thought the United States maybe had a more healthy or oversupply of doctors per 100,000. But it's interesting. But the UK is towards the bottom of this graph, you know, of other nations. And then it looks like maybe this is G20. It doesn't say. There are about 20, maybe a little bit more. And then practicing number of nurses, it's kind of in the middle really, but there is a huge difference between those with the highest numbers and the lowest numbers. And then just on the next page, it shows the number of medical and nursing graduates per 100,000 population, with UK actually sort of middle of the pack actually. So there must be other countries like Germany who do import a lot of their workforce, one imagines, based on this data. And then we did say earlier, have they acknowledged pay? And yeah, they do acknowledge pay. They just said that, yeah, attracting and retaining highly engaged workforce is becoming challenging. It's a difficult market in which to report. And I think later on it specifically sort of says this is out of scope for this document. And I'm sure they wouldn't want to publish a document that interferes with the strike negotiations and all of that. So it's understandable that isn't within the document, but it's not. I don't know. Did you have any other thoughts on
it does
pay?
mention later on in the retained section how headline pay is not the only determinant of how somebody wants to work and stuff. So moving away from pay being the focus, I think, within this document, like you say, whether this is deliberately done to move away from some of the current strike actions, and obviously we're about to head into one of the longest protracted strikes ever done in medicine. So it's really interesting to see that this document makes very little mention of one of the core things that does have an impact on workforce, which is pay. But like you say, I think they've just sidestepped that because of politicking, shall we say.
Absolutely. Just if people were wondering about the comment I'd made earlier about the GP workforce, and that over the course of the last year, qualified full-time equivalent GPs are down 1.8%. But the overall GP workforce, because of the inclusion of trainees, was up 1.4%. So that's just interesting if you're having discussions with people about those figures.
But also, a lot of people seem to think that the reason why GPs numbers are actually going down is because it's the more senior, experienced ones leaving, retiring, that kind of stuff. Interestingly, when you look at the 30 to 35-year-olds in terms of general practice, the number leaving from that element is going up. So the problem we are also having is that people are qualifying, but then they're leaving really, really quickly, and that speaks massively into that retention aspect.
Yeah, or just working part-time, resulting in a reduction in full-time equivalent GPs. Won't spend too much time here, but they talk about the demand drivers underpinning the modelling. I say modelling is quite important. This is a 15-year plan, and they have to make a lot of assumptions to plan against. So they're just acknowledging about the demographic changes, this ambition to move to more prevention and proactive care in the community, and need to address patterns of demand. So that's interesting. So train. Gosh, we've hit the hour mark, Gandhi. It is a big document, isn't it? And it was ambitious, but it's actually really good stuff.
Let's go for it.
Let's go for it. So in the training section, so I don't think we've highlighted too much here, and actually we've seen a lot of these figures before. So they want to increase the domestic education. So they need to increase training by 50 to 65% in order to meet their targets for domestic training. So they talk about this 2.4 billion cumulative will be invested in education and training over the next 6 years. So I think that's, so again, as we spoke before, my interpretation of that is that in 6 years' time, we'll be spending 2.4 billion more on education. Or does that mean that the additional spend over...
I take that to be the additional spend is going to be 2.4 billion over the next 6 years. So you could argue that's going to be 400 million each year. It's not going to be likely. It'll probably be a bit more in the first few years, a bit less in later years and stuff. But they're just injecting an additional 2.4 billion over the next 6 years into the workforce.
So that makes sense, because they're saying over the next 2 years there's going to be another 600 million. So that's 300 a year. 300 over the next 6 is about 1.8 billion, which actually with some incremental increases towards the end of that time period would get you to 2.4. So that's interesting, and it actually puts some of the previous conversation around funding in a different context, doesn't it? Because we were saying that 2.4 is just over 1% of the overall NHS budget of 180 billion, but actually now that increase looks like, in terms of an annual spend basis, looks even less. So the commitment is lower. It's difficult because we don't understand the cost of training an individual medical student, for example, through to being a qualified doctor. But it will be interesting to see a breakdown of how far another 300 million a year goes in terms of meeting the commitments. So interesting. There's about these bespoke approaches to optimize domestic supply. So there's a table, isn't there? Let's go. So this is interesting, and we said that we'd show this. So it gives the aspiration for increasing training places by all sorts of different different professionals. I'd highlighted just kind of the medical student places and the GP training places, and this is where we see those figures. We've got baseline of 400 GP training places, plan to increase to 6,000. That's your 50% increase in GP training places that's referenced throughout the document. Similarly, doubling medical school places from 7,500 to 15,000. That's your 100% increase in your doubling of medical school places. And I just highlighted, actually, I thought, what are we looking to increase at near or 200%? Where's the main focus in the numbers of increase? Actually, nursing associates is a huge area to increase by 200%. Also, health visitors, district nurses, qualified school nurses, so community nursing, they're looking to increase training places significantly. And then advanced care practitioners was the other one that was very high, but all areas are pretty high. Was there anything in particular on this graph that jumped out to you, Gandhi? I think it's reproduced later that you'd annotated against, actually.
Yeah, it is, and thank you for noticing that. But I think, like you say, it shows increases in majority of the routes. There's a couple that we didn't quite understand. So this approved clinicians, not quite sure what that details too, but there's no actual increases in that particular one. It's just staying exactly the same. I think the other thing is that we see the sizable increases in those roles, which are, let's be honest, lower paid. And whether that's to get more bang for the buck, compared to, like the ACP increases are much less than some of the other ones. The increase in obviously doctors and stuff is there, but I think there's an element of recognizing that, some of the additional increases also need to be there. So, where's the significant increase in dentists? Because we're saying that we've got less dentists. Pharmacists as well is actually really struggling right now. Community-based pharmacy has real challenges in terms of recruitment. So, that has an impact on people getting their medications and stuff. So, although there isn't a planned increase, is that commensurate to the population increase and the other increases that need to happen? You could argue, is that the case and stuff? So, I think it's good that there are increases. There needs to be increases. That has to be recognised. I think the document itself, like I said, we've identified a couple of questions already when it came to things like the GP increases, obviously from our perspective, but also some of the other roles.
Yeah. The other thing that jumps out at me, Gandhi, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've not seen any mention of non-clinical staff anywhere. Yeah. And, people need managing, they need human resources, support. It's not just all about the clinical workforce, and these levels of increase in the clinical workforce will need an increase in the non-clinical workforce, and I don't see that reflected anywhere. So that's an area of concern for me as well, just to articulate that at this point.
Absolutely. Where's the support for the increase in our reception and admin based teams that actually without them general practice will grind to a halt very, very quickly, and they're the front of house, let's be honest. A lot of those roles are the first contact people will have when they come into an organization and stuff, and it's not really captured. And let's be clear, they are part of the workforce. Can't just think of this as a clinical workforce.
Yeah, and even I'm just thinking in hospitals and our practices, just managers, to manage the people, do their one-to-ones, rota management. We're talking about later about being a better place to work in the NHS, but that requires good management of people in the workplace. On the right-hand side is percentage of apprenticeships. So this is where we will get to the apprenticeship in a short while, actually, because there are some interesting points around that. But it's looking at the percentage of the places made up by apprenticeships. So you look at medical places, currently none, looking to increase to 13% of all medical degrees completed as apprenticeships in 2031. For example, the other big areas are around nurses and nursing associates, and also healthcare scientists as well, 40%, and allied health professionals in general, 35%. So that's interesting. And midwifery, actually, to say that you could draw some parallels between sort of nursing training with midwifery, that stays quite low, which I think is interesting. Just scrolling to look at
now.
So I think this is where so in terms of medical training, so this is the document breaks down changes to training by different professions. And I think for us, we'll probably focus on the medical training and the GP training, but it does break down by some of the other professions. So we've got that increase in medical school training places and the increase in GP specialty training mentioned here. Need to ensure adequate growth in foundation placements. So these people need somewhere to go after they've done their medical degrees that enable them to continue their education journey as junior doctors, because when you've completed your medical degree, your scope of safe practice is quite small, and that needs to expand on training places, and that needs a lot of supervision from other staff. So they need to ensure that that is there. So talking about the apprenticeships, so I thought this was quite exciting, actually. As I say, the area I work is deprived, and people's aspirations, are sometimes in line with that, and in terms of going and studying a 5 or 6 or perhaps now 4-year degree, possibly not in the city where they grew up, it feels out of reach for some people, but an apprenticeship might be the answer to this. So that's one of the state's aims, to expand the representation of the types of backgrounds people have who work in medicine, which I think is fantastic. And they're acknowledging that actually they're getting pilots up and running from the 24-25 year. This isn't the bit that talks about what an apprenticeship might be. We must get to that in a bit. And they're talking about bringing the SAS workforce in. So that's the specialist and associate. The speciality and associate specialist doctors. So that's doctors who have not become consultants but are working in hospitals, sometimes called staff grade, and how to make good use of them, including supporting general practice.
Mm-hmm. Which we've talked about in previous episodes, so I don't think we're going to go into too much detail on that particular thing. So do check back for the previous episodes, especially given time.
Absolutely. 13% more public health training places. Thought that was interesting. I'm just looking to find, because I'd like to talk about the apprenticeship details. Oh, here we go. Apprenticeship expansion. So I was thinking, okay, what actually does a medical degree apprenticeship look like? I was trying to imagine that. So they've given us a little bit of a clue here. So apprenticeship training routes are employer-led. So obviously they will be in association with a learning institution like a university and a medical school, but it's saying that they're employer-led. The intention is to widen opportunities for people from all backgrounds and underserved geographies to join the NHS workforce. Apprentices contribute to patient care during their training. So I guess that's different to traditional medical school, where you're not really contributing to actual patient care, although people are when they're doing their nursing placements to a greater extent than medical students. So to implement this plan, develop apprenticeship funding, they need to, hang on, what have I written here? Approach that better supports employers with the costs of employing an apprentice. Yeah. So to make this happen, they need to have an appropriate funding model. People need to be paid to have the apprentice, and you've got to work out the payment of training as well, and to what degree does the employer pay. I also wonder if that dentistry tie-in principle might be expanded. Often if you do additional training with an employer, they can contractually sort of bind you to work for them for a period of time. Or if you exit, you have to pay back the cost of training. They're not talking about that anywhere, but I'm just thinking about mechanisms to protect the investment of the employer if we're asking employers to make investments of training. You can see some hospitals in certain areas might struggle to recruit and attract and retain staff. This might be a way of them training their own staff more effectively and subsidizing that. But if it's a somewhat unattractive area to work, or there are other areas that are more attractive, they don't want the brain drain afterwards. So these schemes have to be constructed in the right way, cleverly to mitigate those risks. So it'd be really interesting to watch the space and see how that all develops, essentially. And the final thing, Gandhi, that I thought was interesting, because I love this idea of the anchor institutions, that NHS organisations can be quite important influences on the area in which they are. They're not like the local bank that may close and leave. Actually NHS organisations are generally, in these areas for the long run, can be relied upon by the community, can form part of the community, actually could potentially play a greater role in helping people in those communities aspire to work in the healthcare profession, and so forth. So I think it's just nice. I've heard that in a number of places, and I like that as a concept. So I don't want to move on to some of the other areas that you were looking at, Gandhi, later on. I suppose just to acknowledge what's in it, there's a section about leveraging the impact of volunteers and how to do that more effectively. So this is still in the recruitment section. And they talk about accrediting and coordinating the action of volunteers within the NHS better, and that's perhaps an untapped resource. And they have an interesting case study looking at some NHS cadets, which they did in collaboration with the St John's Ambulance charity to recruit people, actually to a large degree from underprivileged and Black and ethnic minority backgrounds to work as volunteer NHS cadets. One can see this as a good on-ramp actually into some of those other roles, the apprenticeship, nursing and medical roles, potentially linking that up with these efforts to increase the use of volunteers. But I think it's just interesting and probably sensible that they're considering volunteer input in the workforce plan. They do acknowledge that this isn't a replacement for paid professionals within the NHS, but it could be a useful supplement to that. So, and then Gandhi, I think you'd looked at retain, so the third of the three sections. So I'll drive, but you can.
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots that's in here and stuff. It talks about that bold section in number 1 talks about the collective impact in terms of the proposals and how this should hopefully lead to increasing capacity. It's only a couple of % it makes, but that obviously has a sizable impact in terms of numbers when it talks to anywhere between 55 to 128,000 full-time equivalent retention is what they're aiming for over the time of this plan. It talks about, I guess, such as the wider economical labour market conditions. So it does make reference to the fact that some other things may change how well the workforce can work. Clearly, in my mind, this is reference to the current strikes and the cost of living challenges and stuff and things. But obviously, again, it identifies that this is outside of the scope of this particular plan. So it's not going to get involved in that section at all. One of the interesting things about this plan is that it references loads of other plans repeatedly. And it kind of makes you wonder how detailed some of that is. And is this the reason why it's taken so long for the workforce plan to come out? And we've been talking about waiting for this since January at the very least. And actually it was due for almost 18 months, actually. But it mentions the NHS People Promise, which you talked about earlier, Andy. Later on, it talks about the NHS People Plan as well, which is a separate plan. It talks about, there's a couple of others in there. I think it was the CARC. Yeah, it's a bit lower down. It's the CARC review. It's the Messenger review, the Fuller report. There's so many different strands that it keeps referencing. It makes you kind of wonder how much of it has just been pulled together because they've just not had the opportunity to go through it in the detail they wanted to. Or is it half-formed? I don't know.
I mean, you see a lot of that in these documents now. To be fair, and they have to build
stay in the lane.
Before, I guess they can't reinvent it. That would be more chaotic, right? If they were reinventing what was in the fuller plan. They've all got to weave together to form, the overall strategy, I guess. But it gets confusing. Saying that things are out of scope sometimes feels like it's kicking the can back to another review or to an awaited review.
Yeah. So I guess if you wanted more details on those, obviously from our perspective, if you want to go back and have a look at the reviews from those other plans, just check back in our back catalogue and stuff on the channel. We've got that there for you. Key one here on number 4. So it says that single retention interventions have limited efficacy. Now, the reason why I highlighted this in particular is the fact that it makes absolute reference that just making a tiny little change is unlikely to have an impact in terms of your organization. So obviously, if you look at this from the hospital perspective, one change is unlikely to have a huge impact for the majority of people. If you look at this from the community or primary care perspective as well, same principle that you can't just do one of these changes and expect it to suddenly make a massive difference. It is multifactorial, it is multi-level that these changes need to be considered and stuff. And again, that section 5 talks about huge stuff in there in terms of management, compassionate stuff and things, as well as how to do that from a management perspective and things. There's some other stuff in there. It talks about various other things, but the next one I highlighted was that one about the minimum standard, so a little bit higher. What it has set out here is a minimum standard that the NHS should meet. Now, again, it doesn't really talk about who's responsible in terms of that minimum standard. Is that the hospital trust? Is that the GP practices? Is that the ICBs? Is that the place-based areas? Is that NHS England? It's a little bit murky. There's some parts that it mentions in terms of a bit later on about frameworks and that kind of stuff. But again, I struggle to understand who it's actually making references, the action points for some of this stuff. Not all of it, but some of it and things. So I think just recognising that
it's
challenge.
difficult, isn't it? We propose that system partners work together to determine how these actions are best implemented to provide consistent staff experience across organisational boundaries. It is difficult. It's difficult to know who's doing what, but I suppose it provides something of a roadmap.
Mhm.
Yeah, what's in the roadmap, Gandhi? What else is in there?
Well, we'll get to that in a second. It talks about being compassionate and inclusive. It says about the equality and diversity initiatives that have happened over the past few years, and how that, as you mentioned, there has been some increase in that. So more people working from ethnic minority backgrounds, more people working with disabilities in the area, and stuff around sexual orientation, people not feeling they have to declare that in order to be employed and stuff. It talks about more work needs to be done on this part. And I guess the reason why I highlighted this, although there is the diversity plan, I think it's called, I forgot the EDA, yeah, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Improvement Plan for the NHS, which came out more recently. It's interesting that I've heard from other areas that they're actually looking at stopping a lot of these roles because they feel they've kind of done the job. But actually, this workforce plan identifies that it hasn't been done. So I'm going to mention it. If this is happening in your area where they are cutting back on equality and diversity, actually, here's your reference point to say, well, you shouldn't really be doing that. That's not what the workforce plan says and stuff. So it was just some commentary I've heard from various different communications in different aspects of my roles and stuff. And, I think it's one to identify that, improving equality, diversity, inclusion should never stop. And particularly the support for making it, enabling it should never really stop as well. But who knows?
Yeah, and also I feel like inclusivity is often something that you do rather than something that has been done already, if you know what I mean. It feels like it should, for me, it feels like it should be sort of an ongoing process. Maybe you need higher investment initially to just get the ball rolling, but I don't think it's something that you can cut out completely. That doesn't feel right to me.
No. We head down further and we talk a bit more about some of the changes that happened. I've lost track of where we were. There we go. So here we are. Everyone working in the NHS should be recognised and rewarded fairly to help ensure that we attract and retain the staff we need to provide the best possible care for patients. The total reward package, which goes beyond headline pay, will need to be attractive and competitive to respond to both changes in people's careers, aspirations, and labour market. So I took this to understand as this is the part that they're trying to say is that pay is not the only thing we need to focus on, and therefore we're not going to focus on pay.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I mean, if you just thinking about management theory or motivational theory, what do they say is that people need mastery, something, and purpose. Gosh, I'm dredging my memory here. But I think there's something about being valued. Feeling that you're good at something and having a purpose. And I think the NHS is probably quite good at providing mastery and purpose. I guess, the value is still important. I think it goes beyond headline pay, but I hope that they're not saying that that is not a significant factor, given that in other areas they actually sort of directly, sort of reference that it's a competitive labour market and the implication is that pay is an issue. But it's out of scope for this document anyway. That's for the unions to talk to the government about, and that's outside the scope of this document. Okay, so let's scroll down.
So if we move down, so this was one I wanted to mention. So it talks at this point about it's proposed that NHS organisations work with system partners to develop a clear employee value proposition, so EVP, and promote access across the workforce. I mentioned some of this earlier on when we talked about the main executive summary and the kind of forward and stuff, that actually this is something that potentially practice could focus on. What is your proposition that you have to your employees? What is the occupational health support you offer? What are the additional resources you offer? This can easily be a great way of taking off that NHS QoFQI well-being aspect of stuff, and just spending a little bit of time looking at this may help organisations, particularly practices, to identify some of the challenges they mean to focus on to help with that kind of stuff. It then also talks a bit later on about communication pathways and how to, feedback mechanisms, how organisations need to have good communication in order to maintain staff well-being, and that's the best way to have good staff. I guess I identified this, so if people do want to go back and watch our episode that we did on how to engage staff from a communication perspective, so if you've got system leaders, practice managers, etc., watching at this point, listening at this point, go back and listen to that episode. I will tag that into the links in the show notes down below at the end so you can get to that easily. If not, if you type in eGP learning, staff communication, I'm pretty sure it comes up as one of the first options. It's got a red background and stuff, and apologies, we don't have the thumbnail ready to show you, but that'll take a bit longer to sort out and stuff. It then talks about the health and well-being and stuff of the staff and things. Moving down, sorry, Andy. There you go. 34% of the staff have said that they often or always felt burnout because of their work. 37.4% said that they were often or always found that work it was emotionally exhausting. That's over a third of the workforce are telling you that they are burnt out. So if you were not working in the NHS and you worked, for example, in another environment, an office and stuff, imagine if 1/3 of the people around you suddenly didn't turn up because they were burnt out. That's the level of challenge that we're currently dealing with in the NHS. And that for me was just seismic, that's huge.
It would be interesting to see comparative data, wouldn't it, for other professions, other roles, other types of work, how burnt out are accountants at the moment, for example, just to place those figures in context. They feel high, and I think they are high, but it would be useful to have the context, I think, for those figures.
It then talks about occupational health. So I mentioned this point earlier. So maybe an action for practices, in particular, listening to this, is what is your occupational health review options and stuff and wellbeing service. And actually, this should be provided by your ICS. So if it's not, you need to be asking them to look at how they provide that for your practice. This is an NHS offer. This is not a secondary care offer. Made very clear in the document and the workforce plan and stuff. So this one was an interesting fact I wanted to comment. So it should have been over 2 lines, but if you just go slightly back up, Andy. There we go. So it starts just there. So there was a review that showed by the RAND Europe team in East Anglia University that £80 per member of staff in mental health support can achieve a net gain of £855 a year saving through absenteeism and presenteeism. So a 10-fold return if you focus on the well-being of your staff. That's just seismic to me. This is why you do need to focus so much more on retention rather, in my view, on some of the other stuff. Yeah, because actually there's a much bigger focus on training. There's a huge focus on reform. I don't feel, and I'm happy to say this, I don't feel that the document has gone enough in terms of retention. And there's your evidence that it should do, to be honest, that would have so much more benefit in terms of what would currently happen. And whilst it may cost you a bit of money, it will have its returns time and time again.
Yeah, one of the criticisms, Andy, I've seen of the document is that it doesn't really focus funding on retention. And having had a look, I can see funding lines associated with training, and that's where the 2.4 billion is allocated. I don't really see much new funding allocated on staff retention, which is one of the 3 key principles of this document. I don't know if you've seen any mention of funding there.
No, I really struggle to identify funding for retention aspects. It's very much focused more on training, and there's a little bit on when it comes to reform and stuff. But on retention, it's more about changing principles and working structures rather than funding to support that and stuff. And again, we just covered that. 10-fold return if you focus on well-being of staff. That's huge.
Yeah, it's difficult to do that, isn't it, without new funding in a system that's already overstretched and not meeting the demands placed on it.
Next part, it talks about good physical working environment, important for staff well-being and experience of retention. So actually the estates, the environment that you work in and the structures that exist around that have a huge impact. We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in our next episode. You'll be able to join us next week or so. Do subscribe to this because I'm going to definitely talk about it when we get to this topic. But if you compare Google and how they treat their staff to compare to how the NHS treats their staff, there is some serious importance there. But we will cover that next week. So if you want to hear that, make sure you subscribe, notify, all that kind of stuff so you can join us and listen to that episode because we're going to cover some cool stuff in that one. So moving back further down, Andy, Yep, these reforms will all provide professional. So this talks about the changes to the regulation side of things, and we mentioned earlier about how the GMC is going to start increasing additional roles. So the anaesthetic associates and the physicians associates will be brought under the GMC by the end of 2024. This potentially will allow them to prescribe. Interestingly, since this document came out, obviously the BMA have put a vote of no confidence in the GMC. So actually, the whole regulator side of things is a little bit more complicated now. And I've even heard many people talking about not actually paying their GMC fees because of that aspect, because actually, why are we paying for a regulator that we have no confidence? It does talk about the fact the regulators need to improve in this section. So there is some element of, will we see a better GMC enforced by the NHS Workforce Plan? Obviously, that's a whole other kettle of fish. And we did talk about some of that in the GMC report that we did the other week and things. Yeah, some pretty interesting stuff, meaty stuff in that one. Last one I came up on this one was about the NHS Digital Staff's Passport. So this is a electronic aspect of things for staff to transfer between organisations so much more effectively. I mean, how much time is duplicated by onboarding training, people having to do their mandatory training in every single organisation they work in? You know, things like the performers list changes that can sometimes take weeks and months if you get caught out, and just because of one wrong piece of documentation that actually has previously been approved. You know, this would have real benefit and actually would really streamline a lot of the healthcare transfer of staff in particular. So it's a must-do in my view. And then that was it in terms of if you scroll. I can't remember I identified much more in that section.
No, I think that's the end of that section, isn't it? Just highlighting the importance of team working. And there's an organizational development team toolkit that's been published by NHS employers, which people could do. And, you know, maybe that's something we can have a look at, Gandhi, in the future and talk people through that. So I guess final thoughts, having spent some time.
I guess just to mention after this is the reform section. And now we've not gone into that in more detail because I think we've covered a lot of it already. However, if you do want us to go into that section in more detail, please let us know in the comments and stuff. And we can always go into that in much more detail. But to be honest, that's the section that's been covered the most in the headlines and that kind of stuff. And also in terms of, we covered that in the preamble, you know, the earlier kind of content of this episode and stuff. So we're not going to go into that section in much more detail because also that's medium term. I think that's stuff that's also going to change likely in the future. And absolutely when it comes to things like elections and stuff. I will reference an earlier comment we had, and I've just got to find it now. Gone. So I think Christina mentioned it. I wonder if the Labour Party are committed to honour this plan. It'll be interesting to see how much of this continues in Labour's potential control of the government if an election happens, because obviously there is potential changes in that sense on the horizon. But yeah, really interesting part with the reform, but we're not going to cover that part in more detail currently.
Absolutely. And just a few comments from Ritu as well, who's been following closely. Sounds like they've had a good experience of converting a volunteer into an employee, you know, which is absolutely fantastic. And just some comments about politician support for the NHS as well, which I think are well made there too. So, Gandhi, what's your final impression?
Yeah, so I guess our views on this. I think it's helpful having the NHS Workforce Plan finally out. That's the first thing I'm going to say. It is a massive document that covers so many different aspects of care. I think I mentioned this earlier. I don't personally feel it's done enough on the retention side of things. I think the focus of the Workforce Plan, many people were hoping for more meat on the bones when it came to retention, because actually that's the biggest problem we are currently having. Yes, there is a gulf in the amount of people we need and we will need in the future because the population increases, complexity in medicine, general healthcare, and the fact that we are starting so much lower than everyone else in terms of equivalent nations and stuff. But actually the way you help on that is focus on your existing staff, because people are leaving quicker because of the retention aspect. And that's where the cycle of change needs to stop, in my view. And I don't feel the Workforce Plan has done enough on that. It's got some stuff in there. Funding has not been really identified to help with that side of things. You know, one of the bugbears I have many of the times as a trainer, I'm asked to do a lot of extra stuff that is not funded. So I just simply say, I'm not going to do it because I don't have the time and the resources. And actually, if that stuff was funded, that would probably help the system so much more effectively. But the perception is that we don't need to do that, so we're not going to do that. And that's a real criticism, in my view, in aspects of the mentality and the culture that we have, unfortunately, within the NHS. And it does need to change, in my view, because actually people's perceptions of how society needs to change, the focus more on well-being and work-life balance is absolutely there, because that's why people are now leaving. I think the reform stuff, really interesting, some really controversial stuff in there, particularly the shortening of medical careers and that kind of stuff. And I think how that's going to move forward, I agree with you. I think the apprenticeship idea is a really good one, and particularly some aspects of roles are going to lend themselves more to one type of apprenticeship than others. But I think also on top of that, are we going to see a different divergent in terms of the qualifications? Does that mean that those people that have had existing fully qualified training are going to be viewed in a different way to those that have had apprenticeships when it comes to actual employability in terms of pay down the line? They're complicated discussions we are not going to have today, but obviously things that may have to happen in the future and stuff. What about you, Andy?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting document. It's nice to have it published so that we can know what's in it. We can start to work with it. There's a lot of focus on training in it, isn't there? And that's where the 2.4 billion is largely going to land. I think retention and reform are important. It's concerning not to see any additional funding for those things, which are an important part of meeting their numbers target. If you look at their own figures within the report. And then also, there's sort of what isn't there really. In order to be effective, social care workforce, I think needs reform. I think social care workforce probably needs a plan as well, similar to this one. I'd like to see that coming. And actually, for those newly trained staff to be effective, they need people that's going to supervise them. They need somewhere to work. The whole estates issue needs addressing as well. They need buildings to work in. Those buildings need to be maintained. I think that's going to cost more money too, but it's outside the scope of this document. It's interesting that they're not talking about wages as part of the workforce plan, because I think that is quite important as well, although I guess that's going to be addressed elsewhere. I'm most interested in the changes to medical training. The apprenticeship scheme sounds really good in terms of widening access to medical education and nursing education for people from disadvantaged backgrounds. So I think that sounds really, really good. I'm also a little bit interested in terms of what will happen with the 4-year training, 4-year degrees for medical school. That you're right, and whether those will have the same recognition as those from organisations that choose to remain at 5 or 6 years. Particularly if some of these newer places might be at newly created medical schools in less traditionally prestigious institutions, where we're heading for a 2-tier medical sort of education system, as you alluded to. And I think that would be worrying, because the standard of medical education is universally really, really good across the board in the UK at the moment. So interested to see how things develop. I think it at least moves the conversation forwards, doesn't it? Let's watch and participate and see what happens next.
And I think if you do want to be part of that discussion, and I think if you do want to be part of that discussion, again, do subscribe, ring the bell, get notified of all that kind of stuff. If you want to hear more about that episode we've got coming up next week that talks about our recent trip to Google, definitely make sure you join us for that next week, because we'll be talking about our little journey and foray in terms of the Clinical Creator Conference, as they like to call it, that we got to participate in this past week and stuff. And as always, we're going to be here to help tech enhance your primary care and learning. And we will catch